Everything seemed to be going as planned. But then, in a fleeting moment, a remark slipped from Jasmine Crockett's lips, light as a passing breeze. Just a joke. She chuckled, her lips curving into a smug smile, but no one laughed with her. Not the host, not Kash Patel, and certainly not the man sitting in the third row, his hands clenched tightly, his gaze frozen on her face, as if time itself had halted. Crockett hadn't noticed him yet. She maintained her smile, trying to dispel the stifling air, as if this were merely a brief misstep in the live broadcast. Kash Patel remained silent. He didn't look at Crockett or toward the camera lens. His eyes drifted to the edge of the table, where his finger tapped twice, then stopped. Not a word. The silence wasn't deafening. It was taut, icy, like a pane of clear glass, thin enough to see through but thick enough to hold back something on the verge of shattering. Subscribe to explore more stories about the power of silence and presence, like the moment Kash Patel's father changed an entire auditorium. Thank you for joining us, and see you in the next story. The audience wasn't angry, not yet. They were suspended between a meticulously staged performance and a moment that slipped off script. Up until that point, Jasmine Crockett had been in complete control. She commanded the conversation's rhythm, guiding it with confidence. Every word was measured with precision. Even Michael Hayes, the host, leaned toward her as if she were the room's center of gravity. But then something shifted, subtle but unmistakable, as if someone had accidentally brushed against something sacred. In that moment, no one knew whether to conceal it or call it out loud. The camera adjusted its focus. A crew member raised a hand, but no one understood what the signal meant, and Kash Patel still said nothing. In the third row, an older man, in a grey suit, wearing a small badge with 3 stars on his chest, one faded, remained motionless. No one mentioned him. His name wasn't on the guest list. But from that moment, every breath he took began to reshape the meaning of everything just said. The question was no longer whether Jasmine Crockett had gone too far, but whether she knew who was in the audience. This was a dialogue no one anticipated. The real question wasn't who was right or wrong, but whether anyone could be still enough to hear the things left unsaid. Before diving into the story, let us know where you're watching from. And don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the latest stories. That afternoon, the auditorium glowed brightly. Over 200 pairs of eyes fixed on the stage, surrounded by dazzling lights and dangling microphones, as if every laugh and every reaction had been pre-programmed. The space was filled with a familiar feeling, one that put people at ease. In that familiarity, Jasmine Crockett stepped out as if the stage were her birthplace. She emerged from backstage carrying the confidence of a victor in a battle that had never taken place. Dressed in a dark green blazer, her hair neatly tied up, her eyes sharp as a blade, and her smile devoid of doubt, she didn't come to chat. She came to rule. From her very first words, Crockett seized the room's rhythm, making everything revolve in her orbit. She told stories with a calm voice, occasionally slipping in perfectly timed humor, always knowing exactly when to pause for the laughter to erupt, not too rushed, but never a moment too late. When the host, Michael Hayes, asked about the deepening polarization in modern society, she shrugged lightly and replied, "It's simple. Some people grow up with values. Others are chosen just because they fit the agenda." The auditorium erupted. Applause rang out powerfully, nods of agreement rippling through the crowd like a natural reflex. Every eye was fixed on her, as if she had just voiced thoughts everyone held but never dared to speak. Beside her, Kash Patel sat quietly. He wore a black suit and a high-collared shirt, not a single detail out of place, not a movement wasted. He didn't interrupt, didn't counter, didn't even shift an inch. He sat like a still lake, letting Crockett's waves stir and spread across. The room Michael Hayes turned to Kash Patel, his voice maintaining the polished tone of a seasoned host, but his eyes betraying a flicker of curiosity. He asked what Patel thought of the remark, his words smooth but tinged with a careful probe, as if expecting an unusual response. Patel answered briefly, his voice unwavering, "That comment wasn't meant for me." In that moment, the atmosphere paused, just for a beat, but enough to create a palpable silence. It wasn't a dull silence, but a charged pause, as if time had briefly stopped to let the tension sink in. Crockett smiled faintly, a refined and deliberate smile, as if she had gained an early advantage in a game she knew well. From the very first minutes, every glance and every camera seemed drawn to her. The lenses couldn't look away, constantly capturing her every gesture, every fleeting glance, as if they too recognized that the broadcast's focal point was right where she sat. Michael Hayes, known for his neutrality, was gradually pulled into her orbit. Unconsciously, he echoed the points Crockett made, not out of weakness, but because he was swayed by her rhythm, by the way she made everything seem clear, yet sophisticated, sharp. The audience didn't just react naturally. There was something powerful, like an invisible current, connecting them to every word Crockett spoke. Whether it was genuine agreement or simply fascination with her radiant presence, they clapped, nodded, and laughed right on cue when she needed them to. Jasmine knew it. She felt the power growing with every move she made. Her words became more decisive, faster, sharper. In that flow, barbs began to surface, not overt, but sharp, like a thin blade hidden beneath soft fabric. They weren't easily noticed, but those who were perceptive could see the subtle cuts, highlighting the incisiveness in her every word, making people linger on them long after they were spoken. She let slip a remark that seemed fleeting, about how some people are invited on air not because they have something worth saying, but because they fit the story the media wants to tell. No names were needed. Everyone knew who she was referring to. The atmosphere sank, as if the entire room realized a boundary had just been crossed. Kash Patel remained silent. His gaze flickered briefly toward her, devoid of emotion. No rebuttal, not a single unnecessary movement. But then he set his pen down on the glass table in front of him, slowly, deliberately, like someone concluding a note, not on paper, but in their mind. A gesture so small it could be overlooked, yet it carried the sense that something was about to shift. And Jasmine Crockett, still riding her momentum, hadn't yet realized that sometimes silence isn't surrender. It's preparation for the moment that demands speech. For the first time, the camera panned quickly to the audience and lingered for less than a second on the third row. No one noticed, not even Crockett. Another question was posed, this time about how the media portrays politicians. Michael Hayes asked quickly, his voice still fishing for a laugh. "Jasmine, have you ever felt misunderstood just for being a woman?" She didn't blink. "Of course, but I'm misunderstood more for not apologizing for what I believe." Applause erupted again. A young woman in the audience nodded. A man typed something on his phone, and somewhere someone hesitated. Not because they disagreed, but because something no longer felt right. Crockett's confidence began to feel cold. Her gaze no longer fixed solely on Michael Hayes. Occasionally, she glanced at Patel, as if checking whether his silence still held. Patel remained quiet, but his eyes had left the stage. They locked onto one specific person. No one noticed the man in the third row, no spotlight, no nameplate. He was just there in the broadcast. Everything was in place. The commanding voice, the silent figure, the cameras, the laughter, the script. Everything went according to plan until Crockett said one more thing, a remark she didn't expect to echo. And then she laughed, confident, thinking she was still in control, unaware that just below, a man had lifted his head. From that moment, the story was no longer hers. Michael Hayes shifted the topic, his voice lowering as if stepping into deeper waters. He asked about representation in modern politics, a familiar topic, but one always at risk of exploding if not handled carefully. He looked at Jasmine Crockett and asked, "Jasmine, what do you think about those who feel they're no longer heard in the current system?" Crockett leaned slightly forward, her hands clasped, as if weighing softness against the weight of her words. Her voice remained gentle, neither strained nor faint. She replied that everyone has the right to feel disenfranchised, but sometimes she wondered if they were truly left behind or just walking a path already paved for them. Still, thinking it wasn't enough. A few chuckles rose from the audience, not because the remark was funny, but because it tapped into a bitter sense of validation for some listeners. Patel's brow furrowed slightly. His gaze dropped to the table, still silent, with no clear reaction, but the air around him began to feel different. Crockett continued, this time with a calmer demeanor, as if reflecting rather than debating. She said, "Some people enter politics not out of genuine conviction, but because they fit the moment, the campaign, the image the media needs to craft. Not because they're exceptionally capable, but because they're chosen to represent a preset agenda." Her voice wasn't harsh. It wasn't an accusation. It came out like a gentle, objective observation, even somewhat harmless. Then she gave a faint smile, as if realizing she'd gone a bit far. "I mean, I'm just kidding," she added. A thin ripple of laughter rose from the audience, not quite joyful, more like a reaction unsure whether to agree or be wary. Michael. Hayes hesitated briefly. His face betrayed a flicker of uncertainty, as if weighing whether to keep the conversation light or acknowledge that something had been touched. He forced a smile, turned to Patel and asked, "Kash, care to respond?" Patel looked at Crockett for a long moment but didn't answer immediately. Instead, he blinked slowly, then turned toward the audience. At that moment, the camera panned down, and for the first time, truly the first time, everyone saw him. The older man in the third row. He hadn't taken his eyes off Jasmine Crockett. His back didn't touch the chair, as if refusing comfort. His hands rested neatly on his knees. No unnecessary movement, no display of anger, no bid for attention, just silence. A silence, sharp as a blade, soundless, but enough for the entire room to feel. Jasmine Crockett began to sense something off, something she couldn't name, but enough to make her pause. She let out a short laugh, a mix of defensiveness and arrogance, as if trying to reclaim the rhythm of control that was starting to slip. "I know I can be blunt sometimes," she said, her smile fading, "but I think Americans need to be a little less sensitive." This time, no one responded. No laughter, no nods, no murmurs. The auditorium sank into a thick silence, not because her words were too shocking, but because no one wanted to react anymore. In the front row, no one stirred. It was as if the entire audience realized this was no longer entertainment. Kash Patel remained still. His gaze didn't turn to Crockett or seek out Michael Hayes. He looked only at the man in the third row. In that look, something stirred. A question without words, as if Patel were silently asking, "What do I do now?" The camera quickly shifted to Michael Hayes. He looked flustered, as if he, too, sensed something had derailed. No one in the crew was prepared for this moment. No script anticipated the audience falling utterly silent after a joke, not because they didn't understand, but because they no longer wanted to play along. Crockett exhaled softly, for the first time losing her commanding rhythm. What unsettled her wasn't opposition, but its absence. No one challenged her, and because of that everything began to waver, no resistance, no anchor. Then Kash Patel spoke. His voice was steady, not directed at Crockett, but as if confirming something already present. "My father is in the audience. Today," he said. The entire room seemed to tilt toward the third row. Every eye turned to the man who remained motionless. He didn't nod, didn't bow his head. He didn't confirm, but he didn't need to. His presence was enough. Jasmine Crockett turned around too. For the first time, her eyes met his. 3 seconds, perhaps, but for her, it was a free fall. No echo, no anchor. A silent, but resolute, drop. In that moment, she was quiet. No words were spoken, no smile to salvage, no joke to redirect. Michael Hayes didn't intervene. Perhaps he understood, or perhaps he knew any word now would be wrong. Patel placed his hand on the glass table, not to tap, not to react, but as if to hold on to something rising within, something that could no longer be hidden, and perhaps no longer needed to be. I grew up in a family where my father was asked every day, "Where are you from?" Patel said, his voice even and clear. And when he answered, "I was born here," they pressed, "No, where are you really from?" No one interrupted, no applause, no swelling background music, just his voice, calm and sharp. And today, when someone says, "You're only here because you were chosen for an agenda," in front of him, you might think it's a joke, but to us, it's an old wound that never healed. Patel didn't cry. He didn't raise his voice. He just looked straight ahead, each word sinking into the auditorium's silence. Crockett leaned slightly, perhaps about to say something, but the camera was no longer focused on her. At this moment, the audience wasn't there to watch a show. They became witnesses, not to a debate, but to something greater, a stillness, a question rising in each person. If I ever laughed along because it was just a joke, am I keeping that wound open? Something had shifted, not because someone shouted, nor because someone yielded, but because the camera chose to linger. It stayed on the face of the man Crockett now saw clearly for the first time. He sat there, unmoved. He didn't shy away from her gaze. He didn't lean forward, didn't smile, didn't rage. He just looked straight at her, and with that look, every excuse, it was just a joke. People are too sensitive. I wasn't targeting anyone specific, suddenly felt hollow. No one needed to refute them. They retreated on their own. Crockett's fingers tightened slightly on the armrest. She had debated senators, faced reporters, handled protesters, but this time she didn't know where to look. She glanced at Michael Hayes. He was looking down, perhaps reading something or entirely avoiding eye contact. The auditorium felt drained of air. Jasmine Crockett leaned back slightly, not out of fear, but because she didn't know what response was right. The man in the third row didn't step onto the stage. He didn't leave either. He just stood there, hands at his sides, eyes on Crockett, not accusing, not pleading, but carrying a force that demanded confrontation. No words of blame were needed. His silence and presence were the loudest things on that stage. Few audience members shifted in their seats. Some glanced at the person next to them, as if seeking confirmation that they were all feeling the same unspoken thing. An assistant whispered something to Michael Hayes, perhaps about time, perhaps about continuing the show. But no one moved, and the camera stayed still. The man's face, every wrinkle, every strand of gray hair, wasn't deliberately stern. It simply existed like a mirror, and anyone who looked into it saw themselves. Crockett glanced at Kash Patel. For the first time in the entire exchange, they were no longer two opponents facing off, but two people sitting before a father. In that brief moment, Crockett thought of her own father, not to compare, but to remember. He had once told her, "Speak the truth, even if it stings," but he had never taught her how to speak the truth without knowing who was listening. And now, another father, standing silently, was teaching her that more clearly than any debate ever had. Michael Hayes tried to regain the atmosphere, his voice trembling slightly. "We'll move on to the next part of the show," he said. His words wavered. No one objected, But no one was really listening, because the image of the man standing in the third row had become an unshakable focal point. He didn't interrupt, didn't question, didn't judge, but he made the entire audience feel that something within each of them needed re-examination. Patel placed his hand on his chest for just a second, then lowered it and looked at Crockett. His gaze held no anger, no forgiveness. It simply wanted to see if she could look back. Crockett gave a slight nod, barely noticeable. No one saw, only she knew she had done it, and the man in the third row slowly, silently sat down. No applause, no sign of relief, only the stage lights dimming, as if they too understood. That moment didn't belong to anyone. It belonged to the truth, and that truth didn't need to be celebrated. It only needed to stand firm. When Patel's father sat down, something in the auditorium settled with him. No one demanded the silence, but no one had a reason to break it either. Crockett leaned back slightly in her chair and said nothing more. Michael Hayes moved to the next segment, or at least tried to, but everyone could feel it. The flow of the show no longer belonged to the script. Patel began to speak. I thought I understood my father until one day I learned he'd been called an immigrant, only good for odd jobs, despite building an entire career here, he said. No one interrupted. The camera adjusted its focus. No effects, no scene change. He didn't tell me that story. I overheard it when my mother mentioned it at dinner. I asked him, why didn't you tell me? He just said, because I didn't want you to carry bitterness. I wanted you to carry light. A soft breath rose from somewhere in the audience. Someone bowed their head, not out of emotion, but from the sense of a shared memory they didn't know had been spoken. Patel paused, not from hesitation, but to let the audience catch up. I used to think my father was too gentle, maybe forgave too easily. But when I was 16, I saw him stand at an immigration policy hearing. He was the only Indian in the room, and he didn't tremble. He didn't take back a single word. I asked, weren't you afraid? He smiled and said, I'm not afraid of their silence. I'm afraid of my own. In that moment, the audience no longer saw Kash Patel as a politician. He wasn't trying to persuade anyone. He was simply recounting a memory. But in that memory, every detail formed something greater, a mirror reflecting into the hearts of those who once thought this was someone else's issue. Jasmine Crockett turned slightly. Her face was neither defensive nor combative. For the first time, her gaze wasn't focused on herself. Patel continued. When I entered politics, my father didn't congratulate me. He only said, you won't be destroyed by cruel things. You'll be destroyed by words people say as if no one's listening. Then he looked straight into the camera. But today, someone said it was just a joke. Please remember, every joke has an audience, and sometimes that audience is someone who never speaks. A quiet wave rippled through the auditorium. Not a sound, only people shifting slightly, some sitting straighter, some nodding faintly, as if something long avoided had just been named. Then something strange happened. No one apologized to Patel. No one defended Crockett, but the atmosphere tilted toward Patel, not with applause, but with a shift in awareness. For the first time, Michael Hayes spoke without glancing at the teleprompter. I think sometimes the most important things we say aren't in any of the questions, he said. Patel didn't respond. He only tilted his head slightly, not to affirm, but as if to share the story he had just told equally with everyone in the room, including Crockett. In that moment, Crockett lowered her head slightly, not to admit fault, but perhaps to acknowledge things she hadn't considered before. Patel's father remained seated silently, and for the first time he smiled, not broadly, not emotionally, just enough to show he had heard and seen what needed to be seen. In that moment, the show was no longer a talk show. It became a truer version of America, One person spoke wrongly, one chose not to speak, and one shared a past so we wouldn't forget. No one was asked to stand. There was no closing music. Michael Hayes bowed his head and thanked the guests in a quieter tone than usual. Everyone on the set walked away from something both deeply personal and deeply shared. And then the video aired. It didn't go viral immediately. No sensational headline, no edited clips, just a long, uninterrupted conversation with no winner and no one ejected from the stage. 12 hours later, a journalism student reposted the video on a small account with a simple caption. Not because he was strong, but because he spoke of pain without asking anyone to cry for him. Then another post appeared, this time from a father in Virginia, under the same clip. I used to laugh along with just kidding jokes. Now I teach my son never to say that without knowing who's in the room. From there, the video began to spread, not like a scandal, but like a whisper shared repeatedly across small communities. On social media, someone called the moment. Crockett laughed and turned to Patel. The moment privilege forgot it isn't invisible. Another comment simply wrote, he stood up, and we never saw Crockett the same way again. Major news outlets didn't cover it immediately, but a late-night show dedicated a minute of silence, replaying only the moment the man stood up, then sat down. No commentary, no music, no voiceover, just presence. At a high school in Seattle, a social studies teacher showed the clip. No discussion, no grading, just a handwritten question handed out afterward. What makes someone change an entire room without saying a word? Many students wrote, because he was a father. One answered, because he didn't apologize, but he didn't accuse either. An Indian-American student at a California university wrote, because it was the first time I saw an Indian man not asked to explain his feelings. Meanwhile, Jasmine Crockett vanished from the media for a few days. Not cancelled, not because she apologized, but because, for the first time, she declined interviews. Her team issued a brief statement. Jasmine is taking time to reflect and be with family. No one knew if it was strategy or sincerity, but she didn't claim her words were misunderstood. She let them resonate as they were. Some said she hadn't changed. Others said that by saying nothing more, she already had. Kash Patel didn't mention the show again, but 3 days later he posted a photo, not of himself, but a candid shot backstage. His father sat alone after the taping, no phone, no assistant, just the soft hallway light illuminating his silver hair. Patel's caption read, he doesn't need to be believed, he just needs to be seen. The photo didn't make the news, but it was printed and hung in the office of a high school principal in Baltimore, someone once mocked by students for speaking too softly. She wrote beneath it, I don't need to raise my voice to hold authority. I just need to be silent, long enough for them to hear the gaps in their words. In a small Alabama church, a pastor referenced the moment in a Sunday sermon. Faith doesn't come from the person who's right, but from the one who says nothing and still makes you want to do right. Even in politics, where every word is polished and weaponized, some leaders began using the phrase, someone stood up. No further explanation was needed. Everyone knew who it meant, no party, no label. As for Jasmine Crockett, she didn't apologize. But in a later podcast episode, when asked, do you have any regrets this year? She paused for 3 seconds, then answered, I wish I'd known a father was in that audience, and not every remark deserves to be a joke just because I laughed first. There was no applause in the studio, but no one scrolled past either. At a TEDx forum in Oregon, a high school student took the stage and said, I don't want to grow up always being right. I want to be the person who knows when to stop, because maybe someone in the room has heard that remark before, and this time they needed to see someone choose not to continue. No one declared Kash Patel the winner. There was no judge, no lawyer, no scorecard, just a conversation that ended, and an audience no longer the same as when it began. No one shouted, no one clapped in the usual way. People just stood up, not to celebrate but to reflect, to reconsider what they'd once called just a joke, to remember those who never raised their voice but still changed the room. In a candid photo taken in the backstage hallway, Kash Patel was seen sitting alone. No phone, no assistant, just him looking down at the notes he'd once placed on the table like a quiet acknowledgement. No one knew what he was thinking, but the person who took the photo, a freshman journalism student, captioned it, "I used to think strength was never being wrong. Last night, I met someone strong enough to admit they were." The following week, there were no editorials praising Patel, no campaign to elevate his name, just a phrase that began spreading across student forums among lawyers, teachers, and content creators. The phrase, "just kidding," gradually faded. Those who once ended jokes, speeches, or segments with "just kidding" started dropping it. No one told them to. It simply no longer fit. At a small bookstore in Atlanta, the photo of Kash Patel's father standing was printed and taped behind the cashier's counter. No caption, no explanation. When asked why they chose that image, the owner replied, "Because I want people to be silent when they see it." A week later, on another talk show on a different channel, a conservative guest started to use the familiar jab about political correctness and people chosen to fit an agenda. But the host paused without thinking, interrupting gently, "Sorry, but we've had a conversation that taught us some things don't belong in the humor section anymore." The guest fell silent, and the room changed. No anger, just, for the first time, someone didn't let it slide. As for Kash Patel, he didn't go on air to recount what happened. He didn't post again on social media. He just continued his work. But one small thing changed. After each hearing, he began closing his notes and looking directly at everyone in the room for 3 seconds before leaving. He never explained why, but those who had been in the American Pulse audience understood he was leaving space, just enough for people to reflect on their own words. In an anonymous internal memo at a non-profit educational organization, someone wrote, "Progress doesn't always come with loud rebuttals. Sometimes it arrives when someone pauses, listens, and chooses not to continue." By the second week, audiences no longer quoted what Jasmine Crockett had said, but they still remembered the father who stood. A 12-year-old in Texas, the child of an immigrant worker, emailed Patel's office, "You didn't yell, but I know you were angry, and I was too. Thank you for not arguing. I think not arguing is the strongest way to stand up for yourself." Just when the moment seemed to settle into silence, a new video leaked. Backstage, before the taping, Patel sat with his father. He asked softly, "If I don't say anything, will you be disappointed?" His father placed a hand on his and smiled. "You don't need to say anything. Those who truly listen will hear the silence." One show, one remark, one man standing, and one who didn't need to win to make the room think differently. Where are you watching from? What in this story made you pause? Share your thoughts. And if you believe in the quiet power of presence, follow to not miss the next story worth keeping. That moment didn't end in the auditorium. It spread not through sensational headlines, but through small actions. A teacher in Chicago hung the photo of Patel's father in her classroom next to a question, "What can silence change?" A lawyer in Florida, after watching the video, began, pausing 3 seconds before responding in court to remind himself of those who might be listening without speaking. On social media, an anonymous account posted, "Today, I stopped saying 'just kidding,' not because I was wrong, but because I don't want to be the one hurting someone who's silent." Jasmine Crockett returned to work, but her gaze now carried a different calm. During a hearing on judicial reform, When an opponent deliberately attacked, she only smiled, waited 3 seconds, then responded. No one understood why, but the room felt the weight. A journalist wrote, "Crockett didn't win the debate that day. She won by making everyone wonder if they should speak less." Patel's father didn't appear on television again. But at a community fair in Virginia, a vendor recounted seeing an older